Italy, during the Second World War, has always been seen as a weak partner, only being propped up by Germany. Even during the war itself, Churchill referred to Italy as the weak underbelly of Europe. Despite many advantages, Italy was defeated in East Africa, Greece, Libya, and eventually even the Italian homeland itself. Everywhere Italy fought, they either lost or had to get bailed out by the Germans, taking away crucial German resources from other fronts to prop up their Italian allies. But what if this was different? What if in an alternate world, when France falls in 1940, there is a militarily competent Italy, which jumps in on the German side of the war? We will not make the Italians military geniuses, but their army is close to as capable as the armies of France or Britain. But first some history. What are the most crucial fronts the Italians fought at during our own timeline? The first front is the East African one. When the war began in June of 1940, Italy had 15 times the forces Britain had in East Africa. The Italians took the early advantage, but failed to make significant gains, and the front stalled out fast. Even with a 3-to-1 advantage, the Italians were pushed back and eventually lost the entire front in May of 1941. A big issue the Italians faced on this front was the shutting off of the Suez Canal. Without the Suez Canal, these Italian forces couldn't be properly supplied, and more importantly, all 300,000 Italian soldiers were captured, never to see battle again. A huge blow to Italian military capacity for the rest of the war. And then there's the North African front. Italy declared war in June of 1940, but only invaded Egypt 2 months later in September. Why? Because Italy didn't have any preparations for the war ready. They didn't have the supply routes, they didn't have the military planning, and they did not have the soldiers. On paper, again, Italy held a massive advantage on both sides of the African fronts, not only having the superior number of soldiers, but having the complete element of surprise and initiative, while the British home islands are still under direct threat of German invasion. But instead of quick action, Italy stalled. Instead, Italy gave Britain time to prepare and then tried a half-hearted invasion where Italy kept setting up invasion camps which didn't properly support each other, and, for that reason, fell one by one during the British counterattack. Eventually, Germany had to come to reinforce the African theater, and the front went back and forth between the Axis and Allies for a couple of years until the Allies eventually came out on top. Then the final big early front Italy fought on was the war in Greece. Italy's invasion of the Greek nation was so underprepared for the staunch Greek defense that they even got pushed back into Italian-occupied Albania. Now, the Greek defense was very commendable, but the Greeks didn't just win because their army was amazing. After the initial stages of the war, the Greek army was exhausted. And when the Germans joined the counterattack, the exhausted Greeks were quickly pushed back and completely routed. Even with a capable Italian army, the Greek army would have fought back vigorously, but Italy should have been able to win this front. Now, why do these Italian defeats matter for the larger scale conflict? To begin with Africa, the Suez Canal was a crucial gateway for Allied supplies. Control over the Mediterranean could secure for either side favorable trade routes and increased access to resources. Adding to this, a big contingent of German forces had to bail out the Italians in Africa, fighting an unfruitful war for 2 years, which eventually ended in defeat anyways. Adding to this, assuming the Italians managed to push fast enough, the Axis might link up with Iraq and secure the fascist regime there, giving the Axis a lot of oil to help them continue the war for longer. And then perhaps the most crucial, at least perceived, importance of Africa was the gateway into Europe. By controlling North Africa, the Allies could open up a second front against the Axis in Europe, relieving some pressure off of the Soviet Union. Then the Italian invasion of Greece caused Germans to have to make arrangements in order to secure the Balkans. As Italy couldn't win, Germany needed to reinforce their ally or face a new British front which they might escalate at any time. This was at the same time that Germany was planning their invasion of Barbarossa. It is widely debated by historians if the Balkan campaigns actually made a difference for the eventual outcome, but a couple extra weeks of progress before the winter sets in could make a small difference for the German war effort. So, what is the most important change we need to make in this scenario to allow Italian victory on all of these fronts? Italy was building up their army all across the 20s and 30s, but sadly this meant that a lot of the progress made by Italy was obsolete by the time the Great War actually kicked off. The Italians were more than aware of this, and had already begun a new military build-up. But what was the problem? The Italians were preparing to be ready for a war in 1943, or 1942 at the earliest. In this timeline we need Mussolini to be on more of a time crunch. He needs to better line up his own timeline with that of Germany. Hitler sought to start a war in 1938 or 1939. Mussolini needs to ensure that he too is ready to strike around this time. Adding to this, we have the Italian generals, which were fundamentally flawed due to the corrupt system which got them to where they were. Sadly, we will simply have to hand-wave this away and give Italy competent generals, as uprooting the entire Italian social system is not something I want to go into in this scenario. Is this doable? Sure, if Italy doesn't mind going into debt even more to accomplish their goals. In our timeline, between 1935 and 1940, Italy was actually reducing their debt to GDP ratio. In this timeline, Italy would need to realize that the next war will be extremely serious, and a bit of debt is worth it to be completely ready for this war. Italy's economy is not as good as Germany's, and they will never be able to rival Germany or the Soviet Union. But Italy is more than capable of building up their army to a respectable level. Most important is that Italy actually understands the type of war that they are going to be fighting. Italy was wholly unprepared to fight a war in the desert, mainly because of their lack of quick strike forces like Germany had and logistical capabilities to support any offensives. In this timeline, we need Italy to focus just a slight bit more on having at least some armored strike divisions and a capable logistical network to supply an offensive into Egypt and to reinforce the East African theater even if the Suez Canal gets shut off. Now, the Italian goals in the war are pretty much known to all. Mussolini wanted an increased Italy in the Mediterranean Sea and Africa, making Italy into a major player on the world stage. Compared to Germany, Italy did not have many of the majorly ambitious goals or the ideological struggles against the rest of the world. The most important thing for Mussolini was to have fought during the war, preferably as little as possible, and secure a nice peace deal when Germany had actually won. We need Mussolini to just be slightly more determined to actually realize that this is the real deal, and he needs to fully commit to this war in the early stages. It is believed that Italy, during the war, had sought the peace out a couple of times. It is widely believed that Mussolini wanted to secure a separate peace with Britain and bow out of the war. In our timeline, Britain continually refuses these advances for two main reasons. The first is that the Italian campaigns have been a disaster. Italy had failed in Africa and the Balkans, and did not pose a huge threat for the Allies. The British believed that even if Italy switches sides, Germany would just roll over them and be done with it. There seemed to be little reason to sue for peace. Adding to this, the Italian demands were extremely big, desiring to secure as much of Africa and the Balkans as possible. These reasons combined made a separate peace with the Italians a laughable matter for the British to even consider. So, let's now dive into the actual alternate history. In this timeline, the Italian army has more capable equipment and, more importantly, is fully prepared for the eventuality of war breaking out in 1939. They still opportunistically wait out the German invasion of France before actually joining Germans in their war, but when they do, they are more than ready to use their early advantages. They strike North and East Africa the moment they declare war, not months after with a half-hearted plan. The Italians are ready and determined for this war. As I have explained before, in East Africa the Italians had an insane numerical advantage. If the Italians were ready, this would still be a horrible front to fight, but the Italians could put a lot of pressure in the east. Why is this important? Because as long as East Africa remains an active front, North Africa is not safe for the Allied war effort. If the Allies put a lot of forces in North Africa, and the Italians were to break through in the east, these Allied forces would be in a lot of difficulty and have major fears of encirclement. But still, the war in Africa would not be a complete and fast sweep for Italy. Don't think that they reach Arabia in a month and completely capitulate the British war effort in the region. But with the initiative, Italy now controls the war. They advance reasonably quickly into Egypt, and as long as they keep up pressure on both of the African fronts, eventually the Italians would be able to wear down the British defenders. The Italians don't need to completely destroy the British front before winning the war. If the British get pushed back far enough, they would need to evacuate through the Red Sea, or face complete destruction of all Commonwealth forces in the region. So, Italy now has control of North Africa. Somewhere during the African campaign, the Italians also invade Greece. Much like North Africa, this front is still a slog for the Italians, but they make progress. With the Italian gains in Africa, Britain can't really reinforce the Greeks in the same manner, for fear of getting cut off when the Suez falls. In March of 1941, the Yugoslav coup still happens, and a joint Italo-German invasion occupies Yugoslavia. So, somewhere in 1942, the map might look something like this. Advancing much further into Africa would not be worth it for Italy. Italy might invade some of the British territories in Arabia, but Britain will still have a significant navy presence in Arabia, and Britain would probably have sabotaged the Suez Canal when it was clear they would lose control over Egypt. Now, something that is hidden on the map, but significantly different from our own timeline, is German involvement on Italian soil. Remember this for later. In our timeline, Germany had to bail out the Italians time after time, fighting in Greece, Africa, and Italy proper after the invasion of Italy. When, in 1943, the Italians switched sides in our timeline, not only did Germany move forces into Italy in preparation, Germany was already crucially interlinked with pretty much every action the Italian military made. In this timeline, with a capable Italy, this doesn't have to be the case. Italy retains full military autonomy from Germany. So now I could either go into another scenario where I say that these gains don't really matter and the Axis are going to lose the war anyway, but let's do something different. What I suggest is that in this timeline, Italy starts feeling for a separate peace deal with the Allies. Instead of our own timeline, where Germany is interlinked with Italian military operations, Italy has full military independence. This increases the odds of a receptive Britain to the separate peace. Adding to this, instead of a military insignificant Italy seeking peace, we have an Italy which occupies all of North Africa. Mussolini will still demand way too much in the initial request for peace, but the seeds are planted in the Allied camp that Italy may be willing to switch. Adding to this, Italy has one very important card to play. If Italy only suggests peace, the Allies are way less receptive than if Italy suggests joining the war against the Germans, giving the Allies a direct in to Europe, as well as Italian soldiers which suddenly switch sides and are fighting against Germany. If Italy wants to, in any manner, get a favorable peace deal, they would need to switch sides. But, with German victory seeming further away than ever, Italy might actually consider this. The negotiations are still extremely hard, and will require Mussolini to make many concessions. The Allies may be willing to give up some concessions to the Italians in exchange for military cooperation, but there is no way that Churchill would ever consent to Italy gaining Egypt, and especially not the Suez Canal. While it is very likely that there would never be an arrangement reached, let's assume for the sake of this scenario that there is. We will also ensure that these negotiations are kept secret, and Germany doesn't make preparations to invade Italy the moment they switch sides. The most likely colonies changing hands are the French and British Somalilands, as well as Tunis. It is a lot easier to sell off French colonies than British, as the French have already fallen. But this would still not be popular among the Allies, but a trade they might be willing to make. But Italian conquests of Corsica or the French Alps seem out of the question. There is selling out in Allied colonies, and then there is giving up European core land. In Europe, Italy might gain the Adriatic coastline of Yugoslavia and some concessions from Greece, but I don't think the Allies would ever fully sell out Greece to the Italians. Not too many eyebrows would be raised over the exchange of colonies, and the annexations of region in the Adriatic might be reasoned away as saying that it is putting right the wrongs of the Treaty of London and the peace deal of the First World War. But even this peace deal I very much consider wishful thinking for the Italians, especially with Churchill at the helm of the British Empire. But with Stalin shouting for the Allies to please open a second front, Roosevelt might convince Churchill to go for it. So, somewhere in 1943, we suddenly have this situation. Remember me mentioning the Italian military independence. That wasn't for no reason. If Germany was aware of the Italian plans and was deeply connected to the Italian military operations, Italy would stand no chance when they switched sides. If Italy, with little warning, switched sides, they might catch the Germans off guard. Remember that the Germans have more than 4/5 of their entire army on the Soviet border, and they need a significant amount of the remaining force in order to protect for a naval invasion in the West. Don't expect West Africa or the Middle East to last much longer. The tides of war completely shift. Whew. Now, would the Italians swiftly strike out, occupy Austria, and begin to move on Berlin? Very unlikely. Italy is still not a military match for the Germans once the Germans are properly ready for this conflict. The Allied forces would scramble to reinforce Italy. This would be an extremely difficult front for either side to significantly push, thanks to the Alps mountains. But the important thing is the amount of forces Germany suddenly needs to pull from the Soviet Union. Not only do the Germans need to permanently station a significant amount of forces on the Alpine fronts, the Balkans would suddenly be in turmoil as well. Bulgaria, Romania and Hungary aren't as strong German allies as one might think, and with Italy switching sides, they might seek other opportunities as well. Germany would suddenly be stretched extremely thin, as they try to push the Italians out of the Balkans, defend their many borders and coastline, fight the Soviets and station forces in their allies' lands for fear of them switching sides as well. Germany would suddenly need an insane amount of reorganizing of all of their battle plans and army distributions. Germany would struggle to keep their front with the Soviets in any way steady. In our timelines 1943, the Soviets already started pushing back in our timeline. In this alternate scenario, the Soviets push back way harder as the German military situation is no longer in any way comparable. Meanwhile, the German defenses in France would have to be thinner, and the Allies might be slightly faster in pulling off a D-Day, as the Allies are more confident in a slightly smaller invasion force, reducing the preparation time needed. But all signs point toward the same thing, a significantly quicker downfall of Germany. But more importantly is the way the Germans fall down. Compare this Europe in 1944 after D-Day in our own timeline to this scenario's 1944. What's the difference? The amount of land the Western Allies managed to get. The Western Allies, if we include Italy, are in a position to, with collapsing German resistance, move in together with the Yugoslav partisans. Adding to this, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria would be capable of surrendering and flipping to the Western Allies instead of the Soviet Union. And all of this would lead to an alternate Yalta Conference. Italy might also be present at these negotiations, and Germany might be split into an extra slice, with Italy occupying some of the German lands. Something like this is what I predict might happen after the war. Hungary and Romania are questionable as to whether they become Italian or Western aligned or a communist puppet regime. Hungary has a decent shot of switching to the West, while the Romanians are likely to fall to the Soviets either way. But Bulgaria at the very least is likely to be liberated by the Italians or the Western Allies. Notice that Yugoslavia is grey. Yugoslavia is a big question mark, as Italy was planning to annex at least some of the lands of the Yugoslav coast. Meanwhile, the Yugoslavian partisans mostly liberated themselves, and would seek to fight against this annexation. The international community would cry out against any Italian action in the region, but it is quite likely that Italy moves in and militarily occupies the region in order to pacify it and annex their Adriatic coast. And that leads us to Italy in the eyes of the West. Italy would essentially become a second Soviet Union, a nation the West didn't really want to do business with, but they had to in order to defeat the Germans. Much like the Soviets, the West ended much of their friendship with the Italians right after the German surrender. For everyone who points towards Spain and says the West would have little problem with working together with fascists, I would agree on paper. But these Italians are not just fascists. They have actively fought with the Germans and annexed sovereign nations and Western colonies during the war. Italy would still attempt to remain close with the West, but the West would try to keep the Italians at bay, perhaps still promising support against Soviet military actions, but there are no deeper military or economic corporations like NATO or the European Union of our own timeline. After the war, Italy would economically crash, leading to much instability and perhaps even action by the Italian communists, but I still believe that the fascist regime would endure. Internally, Mussolini would be able to use the war in its entirety as a huge popularity win. Italy secured colonial gains and complete control over the Adriatic. Italy fought France, Britain and Germany and came out on top. What happens after Mussolini falls is very unpredictable. But Mussolini easily remains in power going into this new Cold War. Meanwhile, Italy has a lot of trouble with their new annexations, but in the grand scales they are relatively manageable. Even with the full annexation of Yugoslavia, Italians are by far the dominant population group in this new empire. In the coming decades, Mussolini would steer for a full Italian Libya, while encouraging Italians to get kids, so eventually Italians would completely subsume whatever other populations live in the empire. This timeline would both have a weaker West and a weaker Soviet, with the Soviets being hit hard. While the West loses Italy as a reliable ally, Mussolini would still be mostly Western allied, as he would vehemently oppose the Soviet Union. Adding to this, the Soviets would lose soft power and hard influence over much of the Balkans, leaving them in a much weaker position geopolitically. Mussolini would lead a third bloc in the world, joined by nations like Spain and Portugal. They would oppose communism, but seek to remain independent from the West, and most importantly, keep control over their overseas colonies. This bloc would, however, not be in any way comparable to the other two, with the Italian economy becoming increasingly irrelevant under the fascist rule, especially as our timeline's Marshall Plan and the subsequent integration into the larger European economy never happened. With this, more than 15% of this timeline's European economy is not on the side of the West, leading to an even more dominant America when compared to the European powers. To conclude the timeline, somewhere during the Cold War, Italy might switch away from fascism, much like Spain did, and seek greater integration into Europe. But, since the entire Cold War will have fundamentally changed in this scenario, trying to pretend like we have any idea how it turns out is pretty useless. But since fascism and dictatorship have not been proven to be sustainable long-term ideologies, especially economically, it isn't too far off to assume that eventually calls for representation, economic troubles, and continued military actions to secure Africa and Yugoslavia combined to collapse the fascist government after Mussolini's passing. These strongman dictatorships usually need their strongman in order to properly function. So, that is where I'll end this scenario. This scenario was voted for by you guys, so do subscribe if you want to have a say in what subject I cover next. The next subject that has been chosen is what if India was never partitioned into Pakistan and India, but instead remained one big nation after independence. Thank you for watching and goodbye.